Hey cycling friends, James with Team Finish Strong. I'm down here at the battlefield today, getting a little walk time in on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Now, I should let you know, whenever I say I'm down here at the battlefield, what I mean is I'm down here at the Cowpens National Battlefield. Besides the wonderful grounds that are beautifully maintained, they have a museum and a monument that's pictured behind me, and you can go and check it out and experience on the ground some of this nation's most decisive history. Well, I wanted to talk to you today about an online conversation I had with a couple of folks who did not believe in God. They considered themselves atheists, and they had a problem with one particular scripture that was being discussed, and that was Abraham's test of faith as depicted in the book of Genesis, where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac at Mount Moriah. And they had a problem with this on a couple of different levels. Number one, the character of God being questioned, because why would God ask someone to kill the son that God had just promised them? And in fact, the act of asking someone to kill their own son in and of itself shows God to be evil and not worthy of our devotion. And I had to challenge that, of course. I couldn't let those claims rest unanswered. And so I responded to these two individuals. And I responded with this thought experiment. And that is that God had never intended for Isaac to die in this test. Isaac's life was never threatened. In fact, his life was not the reason why God asked Abraham to endure this test. Now, there are some symbology in terms of God sacrificing his son Jesus on the cross. And certainly one could draw those references. But the main purpose in this test of Abraham was to see if Abraham's heart was fully devoted to him, to God. So much so, they would ask him to give up the one and only thing he had been waiting his whole life for, his beloved son. Would Abraham be willing to give even that up for God? And remember, God wanted Abraham to pass this test. This was not a test to cause Abraham to doubt or to fall away or to turn away from God. This was his moment to shine. Well, I explained this to these two individuals and also gave the more obvious example of a test like this when Solomon had to decide between two women as to who was the authentic mother of one surviving child. You see, in that situation, two mothers had babies born, but one died and one lived. And while one mother was not aware of the baby's presence, the other because she was sleeping, I think, as the story is told, the other mother snatched the baby and claimed the child as her own. And now Solomon has this most difficult choice on how to decide this case, this dispute between these two mothers. No such thing as DNA testing back then, my friends. But Solomon's wisdom shined through this. And it shows the type of test we're talking about here. What was Solomon's way of deciding this case? He said that the child should be divided in two and half given to each mother. Sounds cruel, doesn't it? Sounds barbaric. But do you think for even 1 second that Solomon wanted this child's life to be snuffed out so that justice, quote unquote, could be served to both mothers? No, not at all. The purpose of that decree was a test to see who the real mother was. The real mother and the bond that she had with that child would never permit such an outcome. And she willingly forfeited her child to the other mother for the sake of the child's life. Now, the other mother didn't have a problem with the child being cut in half and given to both. She was full of loss and anger and hatred for what she had experienced and for the fact that she was being called into question over this. She would have been happy that the child was divided in half. The kind of, if I have to lose, you're going to lose with me. If I don't win, nobody wins. Well, it helped Solomon see who the real mother was. And the child was restored to the rightful mother. You see, that's what I'm talking about here. When I'm talking about this test of faith that Abraham had to endure. And you know, my friends, God never intended this test of faith in Abraham's case to be one in which it would discourage him or cause him to fall away from God. God knew Abraham's heart and wanted him to win, wanted him to pass this test. And he knew Abraham had the ability to pass it. You see, when all of us face the temptation to fail, whatever situation God allows us to be in, he gives us a way of escape so that we can be able to bear it. This was Abraham's test. This was his moment. And God knew he could pass. God wanted Abraham to see that he could pass. And Abraham did. He was willing to. But he never had to go through with it, friends. You see, there's a ram caught in a thicket, as the story goes. But you know, I believe God intended for that ram to be there all along. It was never God's intention for Isaac to be sacrificed. And that was the point I was trying to get across on that day, online, those two individuals. That God doesn't endorse child sacrifice or these awful things, but God uses some of these inexplicable situations to test our faith, to see if it's authentic, not for his benefit, but for ours. Well, friends, I hope this helps those of you out there who maybe don't understand the ways of God to be more encouraged that God is consistent and that he's good. God's tests of faith may not make sense in those moments, but it's consistent with his character and his intention to draw us deeper and closer to him. And you know, that very day when Abraham passed that test, God gave Abraham special earth-shattering promises that he never would have experienced if he hadn't passed that test. The whole purpose of the test was to bless Abraham, not to harm him, not to take a son, but through that son, him to be a blessing to the entire world. And friends, be encouraged. Whatever tests you're going through, God intends for you to pass those tests. He's got blessings on the other sides of those tests. So hang in there, hang tough, exercise your faith. And for those of you who are not believers, sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper in order to understand the intent and purpose that God has in certain situations in Scripture. You have to have a more thorough understanding of the complete text of Scripture and the character of God to understand any one specific situation. So I would encourage you, though, those of you who are authentically seeking truth about the Scriptures and about the existence of God, to dive in deep. Don't settle for the shallow waters where a lot of people are content to reside. Never getting at the truth. The truth always lies deeper than the surface. Well, friends, have a wonderful weekend. Have a wonderful Christmas. Might even be a white Christmas for some of you this year. I know we've had a ton of snow with this last round of storms that have swept across the U.S. So enjoy it and take care. God bless. And as always, finish strong.